In this video, I'm going to be sharing some tips for more effective communication when it comes to churches, especially when we're talking about external versus internal communications. Let's talk about it. If we're being honest, effective communication is something that we all struggle with, especially when it comes to churches. It's so hard to figure out how to effectively communicate with a large number of people, such as a body of a church. And no matter how many methods you try, there will always still be those people that don't know when the event starts. And they will ask every time, "Hey, what time does this event start?" Or, "Hey, where was this located at?" Because no matter how hard we try to communicate to everyone, there will always be the difficulty of clearly communicating with every single person. So hopefully in this video, some of these tips will help you create a system to be able to communicate more effectively with your church and all of its members. First, let's start by talking about the different forms of communication. There's email, text messaging, app notifications, there's social media, in-person announcements and services, and also print materials like newsletters or bulletins. And all of these different forms of communication have different levels of effectiveness. They also reach different audiences and different ages. Most of the time, churches are communicating by in-person announcements, and that's usually across the board, kind of a given. We're always going to announce things in person to the church body. The next method that most churches usually try is like a printed bulletin, newsletter, or other printed material. And then usually when a church is really wanting to take that next step in communicating more effectively, they try email or text messaging. So let's talk a little bit about these two digital options. According to an article online, research shows that the average person replies to a text message within 90 seconds compared to 90 minutes for an email, and they're checking for text messages more often. Data also shows that on average, most professionals check their email around 15 times per day. In contrast, Americans now check their phones 96 times a day, or about once every 10 minutes. On top of that, 46% of Americans admitted to checking their smartphones before they even get out of the bed in the morning. So if you want to get a response to your messages, text marketing is your best bet. So this article just shows a comparison between email and text messages. And this is going to be different for every person, which is what makes communicating with a large group of people so difficult. So just think about you personally for a second. Would you rather receive an email giving you information about dates or an event or something along those lines, or would you rather receive a text message about it? Are you one of those people that has your email all cleaned out, everything is tidy and in folders, or do you have 3,000 unread emails sitting there with a gigantic stressful red icon on your app? If that's you, then you may not want to receive yet another email that you won't even probably get to for weeks. But most of the time, for most all of us, we check our text messages on a regular basis. So this is something to consider when you're thinking about how can we communicate more effectively to our church. Just think about ways that you would want to be communicated with. But there are some people that really like email. They love to communicate that way. That's how they organize things. That's how they separate, their personal things or their work stuff that's coming in, and that helps them be able to organize better. Does that mean that we communicate with text messaging and we don't do email at all? Or the other way around? So how do we know what method to use for our church? Well, I think it's very important to consider, what is your church's audience? What does it look like? What are the ages in your church? What are the different demographics? And if you're limited in how much you can invest in, say, email marketing or like an email campaign system or text messaging software or a church app, if you're limited in how much that you will be able to do, especially starting out, then just consider, what is the majority of my church and what form of communication would best effectively minister to that group of people. So start with the majority. Then the more you're able to grow and expand your communication system, you can add in more forms of communication. So for example, at my church, we started out with in-person announcements. That was pretty much like the only form of communication. Then you move to like church bulletins that we hand out weekly, or we had stacks available in the foyer. Then you move into posting them on Facebook and posting them on Instagram. Then over the last few years, we moved to email, where we send out email newsletters. And then last year, we implemented a text messaging software. We also have a church app. So we're making sure to communicate in a variety of different forms so that we can more effectively communicate with everyone in our church. For services, we're either announcing them in person or we have video announcements. We have the Church Center app, where we have an FPC info group that people can join if they want to see messages within that group about updates, service time changes, weather updates, any kind of information that we'll put in that group. They'll receive that as an app notification. We also send out monthly emails with our newsletter in them. This will go out to anyone that's subscribed to our email list. And then we have Clearstream text messaging software. We have this set up with a keyword so that they can join a specific text group, and they have the option to opt out if they want to. We also take that same newsletter that we send out via email and that we link in our text message and we link on Church Center, we have that in a printed booklet form that they can grab in the foyer. And we use all of these different forms of communication in different ways. For example, the newsletter mainly goes out through email, text message, and Church Center app. It's also in the printed booklet form in the foyer. But for example, something like inclement weather and we need to announce that we're canceling service, I'll make sure to post that on Instagram so that it reaches a large number of people. And if anyone was planning to visit our church, they'll also know that we're not having service on that day. And then I will usually use text message and Church Center to also communicate that same message about the weather, because these are going to be quick and more likely to be read ways to communicate something that needs to be communicated in a hurry. The number one takeaway here is to find out what works best for your church specifically. Every church and church culture is going to be different about how they receive communication and what methods might work best in that situation. For our church, it's better because we have such a wide age range and such a different grouping of people. We have to hit as many communication forms as possible so that we are effectively communicating with the church as a whole. And you might be wondering why I haven't talked just a whole lot about social media. Social media is an excellent tool to be able to communicate big events, to communicate dates that you want everyone to be aware of, to communicate things like sudden changes or closures or service cancellations. But here's where we get to the part of talking about internal versus external communications. There are some things that only need to be communicated internally to just your church members. There are other things that need to be communicated externally to just people that don't go to your church. And then there's that crossover in between of things that need to be communicated to both. This is why it's not necessarily a good method to treat your social media just as an announcement board. You should create a communication system to effectively communicate with just your church in an internal way. That way you're not using social media for that purpose. Social media should be the platform where you communicate external things and also those crossover items. Internal communications can be things that really just apply to just your church. For example, like reminding them about what's being served at dinner that night, or reminding them of, hey, this week is our life groups. Things relating to the newsletter, or events that are coming up that are really focused on the church and they're not really like guest-oriented events. Internal communications like that are where you need to have a system in place to be able to communicate that quickly and easily to just your church members. For big events or things that are crossover items like Easter or things like that, you can make sure that you're communicating that across all of the platforms, putting it on social media so that non-church members can see it. Maybe doing a mail out to your church members, but also to neighborhoods in your community. But the point is just simply to have a communication system, to have different forms of communication so that you can effectively communicate with everyone and keep everyone well informed. And the best practice is to over-communicate. In my opinion, there cannot be too much communication about something. Communication brings clarity, it calms people. You would just be surprised at how much people really appreciate knowing what's going on, being in the loop, knowing the schedule. It just creates a more positive atmosphere where people feel like they're truly being included and that they're a part. So make sure that you have a really good communication system for your church. Find what works for your church specifically. Find what forms of communication, what people respond to better. And if you're in a place where you just feel like your communication is not working and people are not feeling informed, just try another form of communication and see what works best. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to check out some of the other videos on my channel where I talk about church social media, church communications, camera gear, and more.